Thanks, Lewis. Let me see if I can share my screen now. Yep, I can. All right, I'm going to trust that you all can see this. Thanks again for coming, everyone. And as Lewis said, I'm Casey Boyle. I'm Associate Professor in Rhetoric and Writing and Director of the Digital Writing and Research Lab here at Texas. Today's session is about writing for access. One of the things I want to start off with today is thinking about what accessibility is and putting that into conversation a little bit with what we consider to be disability. When we typically think of accessibility, we think of movement, we think of bodies, we think of structures. We think of someone in a wheelchair who cannot access a certain space or can't move from one space to another. Here's an example of one such problem with disability and accessibility. As you can see, the person in the chair can't easily go from the curb to the street, or from the sidewalk to the street. This kind of problem is typically rectified with, in the last dozens of years, the curb cut, right? And the curb cut is that really easily, and this is a really good example for accessibility, is rather than having the curb rise up 6 inches, you have a curb cut where a chair can easily be accessed from the street to the sidewalk and beyond. In addition to someone in a chair, curb cuts are also good for everyone. If you're pushing a stroller, a cart, wheeling a suitcase, running in the dark, for instance. I'm using that for my own example, so I'll not use that anymore. Anyways, it makes it easier and more accessible for everyone. Now, even with that in mind, even with the best of intentions, sometimes the environment doesn't quite work. Sometimes signals get crossed and you get something like this. You get a curb cut where, obviously it can't be used. So we have the curb cut, we have the ability to for someone to go in, but of course the telephone pole is right in the middle, right? So this is a failure of access. This is the creation of disability. Another example, one that I grew up with, in fact, and one that's a pretty typical example for accessibility and disability, is the sort of humble can opener. So this is the can opener I grew up with, not the particular one, not the exact one, but it's almost exact in terms of style. This kind of can opener was difficult to operate. It was, when you try to grip it, it actually hurts your hand. And those who might have arthritis or other mobility issues, this becomes difficult to use. So the accessibility, the design of it, isn't very accessible. Hence the new modern can opener. The design of this allows for us to have a wider range of users for this particular device. It's easier for everyone to use. And so a typical idea in terms of design and accessibility is, if you design for disability and accessibility in mind, that design benefits everyone, from that to that. All right, so I wanted to start off today with a quick description of design and disability before we head into the agenda. So here's what we're going to be talking about today. First, I want to talk a little bit more about disability and accessibility. I think it's important to lay out what it means when we think about accessibility and perhaps whose responsibility it is. And then the bulk of today's webinar is talking what I'm calling writing for access. And that's moving from the architectural and can opener designs to how does accessibility matter for writing and for the business environment and for the classroom. In this section, I will be talking about the core features of writing for access, and I'm going to focus in on clear and concise use of language, headings in documents, image descriptions, and then at the end of that, I'll provide some additional resources in the form of a couple of books to recommend, a question and discussion session, and if there is time, I have some bonus material. So I'll go ahead and get started. Here's the big takeaways, and I'll come back to this at the end. Here's the big takeaways I'll be talking about today. Disability is the result of a mismatch between a person and her environment. All documents, even those that only have text, need to be made accessible. Accessibility refers to not only the content, but also how the content is presented and formatted. And finally, accessibility, and this is going to be laced throughout. Accessibility makes things better for everyone. All right, so to start with today, I wanted to talk about two different models, basically beginning principles for thinking about disability and accessibility. We have two basic models of disability that we typically use. The prevailing one, the one that has been lasting, is what we call the medical model of disability. This model views disability as something wrong with the individual. And our response to that form of disability or that orientation to disability is to make the individual themselves responsible for correcting their environment, for making the communication that they're reading or not seeing or not hearing something of their problem. And so we typically throw technology at it, right? And this becomes costly for the individual, and it often it overburdens the individual for rectifying a problem that is wider than themselves. The model that's more productive for accessibility is the social model of disability. Now, what this model understands is that disability is something wrong with the environment, not the individual themselves. So if we look back to the person, the image of the wheelchair at the edge of the curb, not being able to easily go off the curb, that's not the individual's problem. It could easily be rectified by making a curb cut, for instance, right? Or the can opener being better designed for all users. And so the model of disability we want to go with in thinking about accessibility is the social model, whereas the environment is wrong. One of the examples I'll give you later is, further resources is Kat Holmes's Mismatch. In that book, there's a really great chapter called There Is No Normal. And we typically get caught up in thinking that, oh, I have a normal reader, I have a normal audience member, I have a normal respondent to a certain communication or visual design or something. And we typically think of that normal being someone who's just like us, right? And whoever us might be. But what disability, if we think about disability in terms of the social model of disability, in terms of the environment itself being wrong, nothing wrong with the individual, then we understand that disability is something that we all experience at some point. And so, for instance, again, from Kat Holmes's Mismatch, disability might be permanent. So, for instance, in one situation, someone might have one arm. So that's a sort of a permanent disability in which meeting up with an environment might always be a little bit frictious, right? Disability might also be temporary. Could be an arm injury, a broken arm, a sprained leg, something along those lines. It can also be situational. So, for instance, if you're carrying a bunch of luggage, if you're a new parent and you're literally carrying, I guess, different kinds of luggage, right? You're carrying a child, right? Opening a door, for instance, might be difficult. So, all of these people, whether it's a permanent injury or temporary injury or situational injury, if we think of disability in the social model, they're all disabled for a particular situation. That could be opening a door, it could be going up a flight of steps, it could be any number of things, right? This isn't just about bodily or like touch or using one's arm. It could be about speech. Someone could be nonverbal, for instance, in that top left or top right corner. Someone might have, temporary illness, laryngitis. Someone might have a heavy accent, which for situational, that might be the environment itself not recognizing, right? Same thing with sight or hearing. So each of these situations make us think about disability in a way that is, like, again, situational and environmental, not so much an individual's problem or responsibility to necessarily correct and make accessible. So to sum up with Kat Holmes, disability is not a personal problem. It's not something that one individual who's experiencing that should have to overcome themselves. It's basically about mismatched human interactions. All right, so I'm going to move into the major talk today. What I'm here to talk about today is writing for access. And we typically think about, like I said earlier, we think about accessibility in terms of mobility, in terms of architecture, and getting one's body from one place to another. But we don't usually think about accessibility in terms of writing. So I'm going to start with the lowly word processor. When this was, invented and generated, it made writing a lot easier. We were able to, import a bunch of different fonts. We were able to use different size fonts in ways that typewriters did not allow. And to make that process easier, what eventually became of the word processor is what we're used to now in Google Docs, in Microsoft Word, even in PowerPoint or Keynote, is the what you see is what you get editor. Now, to make this more usable to more people, they made it easy, they being the software designers, made it easy for you to type and write things. So you would write something like, what you see is what you get. And this is typically called WYSIWYG editing. And this is how most of us learn to write nowadays. And this is how most of us write nowadays. We open up a Word document, we write our text, and let's say we wanted to add a title. The one way we usually add a title is we just highlight, the first line that we write, and we maybe bump up the font size. We might change we might bold it, right? And then, and visually, that is it looks like you've got, a title. You might have section breaks, that sort of thing. But what I'm going to repeat today often is the importance of formatting the text. Here's what this is called Markdown, but initial word processors followed along this kind of usability, where you would have to, if you look around on the left where it says italics or bold or code or links, you would have to tell the computer exactly what you see on the right. So you would have to say, okay, this is going to be italics, and you would have to denote that for the computer. You have to structure it for the computer. To be able to visually see it or print it out that way. But with WYSIWYG, you don't have to do that. And this causes a lot of problems for accessibility in that we get so used to just creating our documents visually to make them look like they have sections or titles or subheadings. But when it comes to someone who, for instance, is hard of seeing or blind and using a screen reader, that screen reader won't be able to read the document in the way that we see that document. It wouldn't know that it's a title and then a body text. It would just read it from one to the other, and it would have no way of knowing that. And so one of the things that we want to do is think through how to get into the practice and the habit of telling our documents how they should be read by screen readers and other accessibility technologies. So Sarah Horton and Whitney Creasenberry, another source I'll give at the end here, want to talk about the difference between usability and accessibility. That's what we just saw with that example between Markdown and the WYSIWYG editing I just showed you. Usability, on one hand, is about trying to make it easiest for the most people, and for often what this excluded was issues of accessibility. So making something WYSIWYG or what you see is what you get editing is very usable for a lot of users, but the end products don't typically come out as being very accessible. But as Horton and Creasenberry note here, good accessibility is designed for the full range of capabilities, as well as the context or use of environmental constraints. So core features of accessible documents, here are the core features. Number one, they're clear and concise content. Number two, the heading and document structure is present. Three, hyperlinks are noted in the document and encoded correctly. Bullets and lists are used or is formatted as such. There's color contrast between, for instance, you're not going to want to use one of those old like geosites or MySpace web designs where you have like lime green text on, I don't know, dark or light blue or yellow background, right? You can't see that. Images have alt text and captions for any videos. Now I'm going to concentrate on these three things today. First, clear and concise content. I'm going to talk about what that means and how to do that. Document and headings and document structure. I'll go through a couple lists of how to do that, and also an image alt text exercise. I'm going to have you all, hopefully I can be able to see that, but I'm going to have you all give me some feedback on. So for clear and concise content, we use simple language and formatting as appropriate to the context. So again, this is something I can repeat over and over again. Universal design and designing for accessibility makes good design possible. It just makes good design happen, right? So some principles for how to accomplish this. Write in clear, short sentences and paragraphs. I'm gonna have an example here in a second to go through all of these. Avoid using unnecessarily complex words or phrases. Consider providing a glossary for terms for readers may not know. Expand acronyms on their first use. For example, Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. And so in parentheses, you write that, and then every time afterward, you could write WCAG. Again, what this is for is for general usability and accessibility, and it helps with screen readers who are reading the text, whether it be a PDF document or Word document or even a web document. Use list formatting as appropriate, and consider using images, illustrations, video, audio, symbols to help clarify meaning. Another thing I don't have on here, but I'll talk about in a second, is by using images, illustrations, and video, you're layering on different ways to approach the same exact content. And here's an example. So on the left, we have basically a procedure for doing claims for an insurance company. On the left, if you read it, it takes you, first of all, when you approach it, it's not like necessarily short or clear sentence or paragraph, right? It's just a big block of text, and you kind of have to like work your way in. So just visually, for anybody, this is like that first can opener we saw. This is the one that's like hard to grasp. You have to be really deliberate about it. You have to focus really hard, and you can work your way through it, sure, and you can get that can open, sure. But it's certainly not the easiest way to do so, nor is it does allow for repeated use. So on the second side, though, what we see is the exact same content. It's exactly the same, but it's slightly different in that it's formatted and structured vastly different. It's got short, clear sentences and paragraphs. It spells out the acronym first and then uses it in the short term. It uses a list, a bulleted list, to break up these 4 or 5 sentences in there. It uses an image and a graphic to retell the story, right? The repetition is really important here for accessibility as well. So let me give you an example. So that's one example of clear and concise content. Here is an example for headings and subheadings. Again, this one comes from writing for web accessibility, but I think this is also really important for regular print-based documents or PDF documents as well. Again, we have half of it here. We have a good heading and subheading, and the paragraphs are somewhat small. The text is somewhat clear, but it can get better. Here's an example of how it can be better. So here's our major heading. This is all the exact same text, but the text on the right is so much more easier to read and navigate than the text on the left. The text on the right, it has the clear heading 1 heading up top. It has a quick summary orienting your reader to the text in front of them. Almost like if you are into film, you have typically you have this like establishing shot that establishes the scene of a place, and then you can focus in on, certain components of it. But in writing, this is the same way it happens with the abstract, the general heading, and then you go into heading 2, which is slightly smaller than heading 1, and then heading 3 when you go to heading levels on the right. Each of these are called nested headings, and it not only allows for you to visually orient yourself and show which text is subordinate to which other text, or which text is, further details of some more primary text, but it also helps a screen reader read these things and give it an order of reading. Because visually, we look at this, a lot of us might look at this and see like an order here as opposed to the order on the left. But if you're using a screen reader, you need to tell your text how the screen reader does that. Now, in Google Docs, as I showed in the very beginning, this normal text highlighted, again, there's no normal, right? Google text likes to say this, but normal text would be, for instance, body text would be the text for, the HTML element provide information, that sort of thing, right? That's normal text. But on the left, on the bottom left, what you see here is a drop-down box. After you click normal text, you can, you format your text with title. If it's a subtitle, you give it headings, and you can further go down. Usually it's about 6 different heading sections you can do. And you want to make sure those are nested. And so you don't want to have like heading 1 below a heading 2. You want to have like, heading 1, and then all of the subsections or major subsections have heading 2. And if there's any subsections within those, it's heading 3, and then 4, and then 5, and so on. On Microsoft Word, you have the exact same thing. Heading 1, heading 2, it's exactly the same thing. Even in Keynote or PowerPoint, you have something similar where we often, and I know I've been guilty of this before, is going to the blank space, the blank slide, and just using that and just adding my text box, creating it how big I want, that sort of thing. But what typically happens was when you give that PDF to someone, either as a PDF, I'm sorry, if you give that slides deck to someone either as a PDF or as a slide deck, and if you only use the blank one and do your own formatting and don't use the already pre-formatted slides, then what you're doing is robbing that person of an accessible document, right? And so if you start with the pre-formatted templates, and you can adjust those. So for instance, if you want to use title, bullets, and photo, you can adjust those as you will, as long as you keep the formatting behind it correctly. Then if you turn it into a PDF or give it as a slides, then those things will be accessible for readers who use screen readers or any other accessibility device. The same thing goes for creating. The same thing goes for creating Word documents by using the formatting of headings and alt text, which I'll get to in a second. When you turn that into a PDF, it will carry forward its formatting, and the PDF will also be accessible. Now, often what happens if we don't do that is that we get an image. So the text itself, forget about the text. It doesn't. It's insignificant for this. But so this is a text I scanned for a class I was teaching, and when I scan the image, it turns into just an image, the text. And so a screen reader, or even if you wanted to try to find a word in here, it wouldn't recognize it because all it is an image. The computer won't recognize that these are actually words. And so one quick and easy way to do this is to OCR it, or perform an optical character recognition function with a PDF reader, or either Adobe or some other PDF reader that will turn this image into what it recognizes as words. And then you can say, oh, control, I'm going to find the word screenshot in this document, right? That's half of the way to making it accessible, but there's a lot of other things you got to go do as well. So To make a PDF accessible, let's say in Acrobat Pro, you have to convert it from an image, like I just showed you, to a text itself. And I can provide these slides for you all, whoever needs them. At the end, my email will be there, and I'm happy to share these slides. Is converting it from an image to a text recognition. And then you have to go through, and just like we saw in that Word document of showing, which is a heading, which is body text, which is an image, give it an alt text. You've got to go through and tag that structure. And I'll show you how this looks on the PDF document. And so you have to tag the structure for how to read it. So for instance, adding text to images, setting the reading order, and setting the language for all of this. This is all telling a screen reader, for instance, how to read this document. So if we look at this, if we only made the text available to be read by a screen reader without giving it word order, without giving it descriptions for the images, or identifying the headings, it's just going to say 3 screenshot, the photographic. It's just going to say it all in one long spurt, and it will make it kind of unintelligible. Not only that, but it won't know exactly where to start, because we have a text here that has 2 different columns and different elements going on in all of it. So you've got to be able to show that, you've got to be able to denote where the screen reader should read and where a document should start and how it should read it. So if, for instance, it'll say here, screenshot, that number 1 where it says screenshot, the photographic witnessing of digital worlds. That is what a screen reader will read first. They'll go there, and then instead of like going over to the column on the right, it'll read the second box, and then it'll go to the column on the right for number 3. And then it'll look at each of these as images down below the figure of the Trump tweets, right? It'll go the figure of and you can put that in there, the alt text and the alt description. So as a that's how that works for making a document that's not accessible already, making it into an accessible document. The final thing I want to talk about today is alt descriptions. I wrote a short blog post on HDO's blog for this. Here's an example for alt descriptions. So Alaskan brown bear, if someone's reading this website with a screen reader, what will happen typically is if there's an alt description, the screen reader will see that it's an image, and then it'll give you the alt description of that image. Now, there's a bunch of different ways to describe this scene. What you want to do when you do alt text is you want to be accurate and present the content, but also the function of what's being presented in the image. So for instance, it's 2 bears, sure, but what's going on here and how does it relate to the rest of the document? Be succinct. So typically these are about 120 characters or so, 150 characters max, in terms of like what's being described. You can't be like overly descriptive, usually because the screen reader will read it and it'll just keep going and keep going. So you want to be kind of succinct. You want to be redundant. So you don't want to present the same exact thing that the text itself is saying around it, right? And you want to avoid uses like image of, graphic of, because when the screen reader reads it, it's going to automatically say image, and then it's going to say what it is, right? And so if you say image of, it's going to say image of bear. And so that just takes a lot of time for a screen reader to get through and to read it. So to do an alt text in a Word document, for instance, all you have to do is click the word, or right click, and then put edit alt text. And then on the right, you'll see alt text come up as where you can write that in there. This also works for social media as well. I know that Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram all now have abilities to add alt text for images. And this is really helpful for people who use screen readers for images. So I would highly recommend that for those of you who have companies or teams who use social media for anything, is to amp up the use of that alt text. Yeah, so Keynote and screen Keynote and PowerPoint, same exact thing. Alt text, right click, you can add the alt text, and the description over here has that. Oops, hold on a second. All right, so what I was going to ask you all to do today was to describe. Oops. Let me see. I might be messing this up. I have to see the chat. All right, here we go. All right, now that I can see the chat, I'll reshare this. 1 second. All right, can you, I'm guessing you all can see my screen here. I'm hoping. All right, so if you had to describe this alt text in 120 characters or so, thanks, Louis. If you had to describe this in 120 characters or so, give me a description of what this alt text is, and you can use the chat function for this. I'll wait for a minute and let you think about it. So think about what's going on here. Know that it was in, let's say, I'll give you this, okay? So here's where it's gonna be. If this was a document, it's a website, right? But if this is a document, you wanna make it succinct. You don't make it repetitive. You wanna put it in the function of this particular, let me see. Oh, hold on a second. I'm trying to get to the chat and it won't let, oh, there we go. There we go. All right, here we go. So two brown bears next to a stream in front of a mountain range. That's excellent. Thanks, Julie. Two brown bears standing in a field near a pond with snowy mountains and cloud. Samantha, that's a great one. It really gives like an image of it, right? And that's still within like 120 or so characters. Alaskan brown bears on the move for food. Now, do we really know that, Peggy? Yeah, probably. We probably do. Two grizzly bears, one upright, the other on all fours in an empty plain with snowy mountain range in the background. Thanks, Brandy. One of the things, I use this one a lot in these kinds of workshops because what happens usually is that people, yeah. So here's what Kathy says. One brown bear standing and another walking through a field. One of the things I like to joke about here is like, no, they're both standing, right? They're both standing in that, and this is where we think of only one standing because we're thinking of our own bodies, right? And that's what standing means. And the other one isn't standing; it's just walking. So there's a lot of interesting ways we can go about to do this and to write the alt text. Here's the one that is used on the site itself. Two brown bears standing next to a stream in the Alaska brown bear diorama. Now, I didn't know this was diorama, and this is something you have to like scroll to the end of the website for. So, no point taken off for you all not knowing that. But this is a typical good descriptive situation of web accessibility. Here is 1 second. Get rid of it. Okay, so again, so here's the takeaway here, and then we're gonna have time for the bonus material. So again, disability is the result of a mismatch between a person and her environment. As we see in some of these like communication accessibilities, not paying attention to how we're structuring documents, PowerPoints, websites, images. This shouldn't be the problem of the user. This should be a responsibility of the writer to make it accessible for all audiences. All texts, even documents that have only text components, need to be made accessible. And this is just getting into the habit of properly formatting your document and using the style designations to style the document thoroughly. Accessibility refers not only to the content, but how that content is presented. So as we saw in the clear and concise language use, that's the content, sure, but it's also how that is formatted and used. So we could be clear and concise, but if we don't format that clarity and concision correctly, then it's not going to be very accessible. And finally, accessibility makes things better for everyone. So one of the examples we see is, for instance, closed captioning is like one of the best examples for how, one of the best examples is for how, closed captioning has made it better for everyone. So for instance, closed captioning is good for people who cannot hear what a television or video is saying, but it's also great for if you're on a bus, for instance, and you're watching a short news video and seeing the closed caption without having to add more noise to a bus, or if you're in an airport and you can't hear the television and you can see the closed captioning instead, right? But just like we saw in that one example of the telephone pole in the middle of the cutaway, the curb cut, we also see lots of examples of captioning fails that are, again, well-meaned, but potentially gets at the difficulty and it gets at the difficulty of how to interpret certain things and making them accessible. So for instance, here's a couple good examples of closed captioning fails. So porpoise noise continues. These aren't necessarily fails. These are usually called fails, but I think they're actually really good ways to. They're actually really good ways to see how interpretive making things accessible really is. So, for instance, sadly, go-karts. I'm not sure how that is necessarily. I'm not sure how that is necessarily a sounding, but it's still using closed captioning to get a mood of what's going on, perhaps with the sounds in the background. Scary crime music. Looks at nachos. I don't know that we needed closed captioning for that, but it's helpful to have. Stealing intensifies. I'm not sure what that sounds like, but it looks like it's there. Sobbing mathematically. This is me anytime I'm doing any sort of a quantification of anything. So I'm just pretty much sobbing mathematically. And then this is one of my favorites, the last one. And then I'm going to zoom back to resources and questions. We want to make sure that everyone can get the tic-tac sound on tennis. So I'm going to zoom back for a second. Here are some additional resources of things that I've used in my classes and my workshops. If I were teaching a longer, seminar or workshop on this, these are further sites I would bring in. Obviously, I've already talked about the mismatch one. That's a really great introduction to thinking about disability and accessibility through that social model. Reading sounds is about closed captioning and how inventive it can be, honestly, like some of the things we've already seen. This What Can a Body Do is something that just came out recently, and it's about a critical designer who designs for a number of people with disabilities. Building Access is really great for a historical take on the accessibility movement and disability studies more generally. And A Web for Everyone, this one's going to be put into a second edition pretty soon. But this one's really good, not only for if you're doing anything on the web, websites for accessibility, but also for like we were doing today with documents and whatnot. So yeah, those are a couple and I'm happy to offer more as needed. So I guess we're ready for questions. If anybody has any questions. Samantha asked, what is the title of the last book? It was A Web for Everyone. And that is by Sarah Horton and Whitney Creasenberry. And it's a really great, that book is a really good one in that it has, it not only talks about how to make things accessible, but it talks about why. And one of the good things about that book is it goes through a number of personas of people and like what kinds of situations they might be in. And it doesn't think about So for instance, if someone is, sight impaired, it doesn't say, oh, they can't see. It says, yes, they're sight impaired, but they can do these other things, right? And so it looks at, again, looks at disability in terms of a social model and also situationally, and doesn't rely on this sort of deficit model of this person can't do this, but it puts it into a fuller context. So I would really highly recommend that book. All right, let me see. Peggy, why do I say print her environment? I just used a pronoun. What it says. When writing alt text, what assumptions should we avoid? I mentioned feeling hesitant to use color, for example, since someone visually impaired may or may not have context for that color. I think color is really an important one. And if we had more time, I would talk a lot about color contrast and how to use colors. Color is cultural. Certain colors evoke certain kinds of moods and certain kinds of attitudes throughout different kinds of culture. And I think even if you're sight impaired, you've been in the culture, whatever culture you're in, you've been in it long enough to know that certain colors matter, right? And so if someone was flying the American flag, for instance, you could say, the red, white, and blue, and it matters and it means something. It's got a cultural significance when you say the red, white, and blue. So I wouldn't shy away from using color at all. It does, even if it can't be like seen in the same way that some of us can see it, color is still something that keeps going. Please do another webinar on color. This could be like a really good one, right? It's like a really long one on color because there's all kinds of different things about color contrast, certain colors to use over other colors. And certain cultures might use one color, like a yellow, for instance, might come across in one culture as kind of soothing, and in another culture might come across as like kind of signify death, for instance. So let me see. For alt text, do you have any tips? Oh, I'm sorry. Do you have any tips, balance between accurate description and opinion? As a transcription and caption person, I'm used to skipping literal image and not interpreting images. It depends. I think if, like, as writers, so the question here is like, do you want to do literal or interpretive? I'm kind of siding towards interpretive. I don't know that, I think it's really tough to just say something is literal and have like a quick, like an only description, right? As it being like, because when we use images, we're trying to evoke a mood. We're trying to bring about an attitude a lot of times. If we're using an image to bring about a mood or an attitude, then maybe putting something in there like menacing dog, right? Maybe using a sort of like artistic description is actually trying to do the function of it, right? If we're using something that's a figure and it's like in the example I showed with the car insurance example, perhaps a more literal description there, a more sort of like clean cut, concise description there might be more useful. Let me see. There's a bunch of questions here. I'm trying to get my bearings in here. Yeah, so I think we need to know more about sight impaired / hearing impaired culture to be really good at writing for Access. Absolutely. And again, this has only been like a 30, 40 minute sort of webinar. It gets even further because a lot of times when we write, like typically, when I say we, I'm just saying like me, for instance, when I write, I have to work against writing spatially and thinking about writing chronologically or temporally. Because spatially, I think, okay, this text box goes here, this text box goes here. And I'm thinking about writing for someone like myself who's seeing it first. But if you're writing for someone with a screen reader, you have to rethink your text in a temporal way in which something else is going to be reading it for them. They can speed it up and slow it down, all that good stuff. But it really does change your orientation to what you're writing and how you're writing it. If you have to, think through like the devices through which that text is going to be read or experienced. Do you know of any programs, apps that can determine if a text doc or presentation is accessible? For a site, absolutely. You can just type in website accessibility checker, And there's a bunch of them out there. If you just type in if you give it the URL, it'll check it and give you a report on its accessibility. It'll let you know if all the alt texts are there, if the page is described correctly, if the headings are correctly there, and a number of other things that go into website accessibility. For PDF, I know Acrobat, that's the one I use the most. It allows you to do an accessibility check. You can run an accessibility check, and it'll tell you exactly the same thing that website accessibility checker would also tell you. Same thing with the Word document. Let me see what else. Oh, and Lewis says, I think I have some work to do. Yeah, I mean, if you put up a website, if you put up a PDF on a website, for instance, even if your website's accessible, perhaps the PDF might not be, right? And I'll give you an example of like the worst designed websites out there are typically restaurant websites. And trying to find and navigate a menu, like I would say like 8 times out of 10, any website I go to for a restaurant, it just fails accessibility, not only for someone who is reading through with a screen reader or using their phone accessibility features to read the document or the site, but also just for our own benefit, right? Like a lot of times it's like, if it does have a menu up, it's a PDF, and you've got to, if you're on your phone or a computer, you've got to be able to like, zoom in, look around. It's really difficult. So what restaurants have some of the biggest challenges in making their websites accessible for a number of people. And yeah, Rachel, thanks, Rachel. And Rachel, website accessibility initiative is one of the things I pulled some of those images from, especially with the insurance example of the clear and concise text. If you go to website accessibility initiative, just type that in. They have just a load of different guidelines for how to make text accessible and how to correct bad accessibility. So thanks, Rachel. What else? Menu accessibility fails. I would read that book or blog. Yeah, I mean, there's a number of like, you could just like, I teach a couple classes in accessibility, and one of the things my students like to do is they go through, and that's where I tell them first, like they need a bad example, and so I would show them that, and it's just like a gold mine of accessibility fails. What about making something developed for consumption on a website accessible to a smartphone? Are there tools for this? Yeah, absolutely. That's one thing I didn't even get into at all. Is website accessibility and usability have started to kind of gel and become more coextensive as more mobile devices are becoming the primary place to access websites. When you make something accessible to a phone that can also adjust to a computer, a laptop or a desktop, right? This is called responsive web design, and that's basically being responsive to a mobile device or a PC, for instance. And a lot of times that has included more and more accessibility features, not just good usability features. So, but yeah, there's a lot of tools for that, I think. If you mark alt, this is Kana says, if you mark alt text for images in the original Word documents that you make into PDF and then post on the web, yes. So basically, when you format a document in a Word document and you export it as a PDF, it will retain all of that formatting. And so this is why it's best to get into the habit of developing any Word documents or memo or whatnot, using formatting for that right away. And a good example of why this is helpful for us, as like for everybody actually, is if you format a Google Doc, for instance, Google will automatically generate a table of contents for you on the left side where you can zoom through your doc, and it'll have all of your headings on the left, so you can like go back and forth throughout your doc on Google Drive or Google Docs, right? And then when you export that as a PDF readers will be able to read that, and screen readers and people's PCs. Do you know of one wiki to rule them all of your accessibility? No, I do not. One of the problems with this is that as one of the problems with having a wiki, right, is that is that technologies change, and as they change, the accessibility workarounds and design changes as well, and it's really tough to keep on track of all of those things. But the Web Accessibility Initiative, that one helps a lot. I think that one's a really good one to go to. What I kind of do is I have a couple, I can't remember their names, but I have a couple that have, you know, I have a couple of links where I just go to those kind of places. And sometimes after a while, you kind of just internalize some of the rules. And wiki, yeah, it's kind of funny. Yeah, and yeah, I mean, this is this is something that I actually went to an accessibility conference a couple of years ago, and the participants in the audience, we came up with that exact same question. It's like, we need one resource that will generate for everybody, right? That we can all go to for all times, and that would bring it all together. And we were all like really jazzed for like 15 minutes, and then we all exchanged emails, and then a day went by, 2 days went by, and like life seeps in, right? And it's just have to develop it and put it all together. Let me see.
Casey, I have a quick question.
Yeah.
I was just curious, as someone who's contemplating designing a second language version of our website, first in Spanish and then maybe into other versions, how does language align with accessibility? Are they two different things, or is it an overlap?
Oh, I think it definitely overlaps. I don't think language really, I mean, it does matter, but I don't think it matters too much. I mean, you're still going to have paragraphs, you're still going to have headings. The structure of that document is still going to be the same. And so, for instance, if you're doing you know, if you're like using the HDO and you want to make that into a Spanish version, you know, it's going to have this exact, you could actually like have the exact same thing and just change the text and add the text in there. And keep the same formatting, it should be fine, right? But I would, yeah, I don't think it matters too much. This is where the difference between form and content. Now, it might matter a little bit visually, depending on some languages, right? I can imagine like Chinese and Japanese being somewhat, you know, very different in terms of accessibility than I'm equipped to make, right? So so if you're going in, but for like Latin 8 kind of languages, it's gonna transfer pretty easily.
Casey, I'd like to ask a question too.
Yeah.
Turn my video on for just a second. I just wanted to say I love two ideas in this presentation. The idea that accessibility is sort of this this rationale for striving for principles of good communication that we already have, and then also the thing you said about the possibility for creating accessible communication as being really inventive. And I would just love it if you could say a little bit more about the inventive aspect of it.
Yeah. Thanks. No, that's good. This is where, like, I would recommend that book that Sarah Hendren I recommended about What Can a Body Do? Is that like when you, like, for instance, the alt text example I used earlier is using alt text as more than just literal description, using it as also like a space to put, you know, a poetic description in there that would add to the text for someone who can't see the image itself. That's thinking about your document in a totally different way, and in a much more inventive way than using literal description alone. It also, like when you, like, I would also say the captioning itself. Captioning, we might think, it's just giving you, you know, what's being said, you know, auditorily, right? But when you add captions to images and you make them standard, like you have with like CNN when you're in an airport, this invents a whole new situation in which we can communicate differently, right? So typically before captioning, we had to hear what's being said on TV to understand what's going on. But with captioning, we're able to like stand at a distance and read it and not even hear it, right? And so these are all kinds of different ways to go about, to think about accessibility being inventive of new situations. So for instance, if I go to the gym and I watch and I'm on like the treadmill, for instance, I can look up and see and you know, watch a newscast and in a way I wouldn't able to before, right? So I think that's pretty inventive in terms of how we relate to one another, how we relate to communication. So I think that's one way in which invention happens when accessibility is thought through.
Okay, everyone. Well, that'll wrap us up for the day. Thanks for all the great questions, and for and to Casey for all of his insight. I'll send a follow-up email to everyone after this that will include the recording, as has been mentioned previously. And I also just wanted to point out that Dr. Boyle and his rhetoric and writing colleagues here at UT Austin are working with HTO to develop several new certificate programs specifically around communication related issues, storytelling, writing for social change, collaborative writing, writing for access, and several other topics. And we're going to be launching those programs, at least some of them in 2021. And so we'll be in touch regarding those. But thanks again, everyone, and hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks, everyone.